Welcome. We now join Fred Kuhn and his guest.
Welcome, Lisa, and welcome, Susan. The question in this part of the mini-series is we've been hearing so many allegations over the last 6 months about the prevalence of sexual misconduct in the workplace. Is this a new issue?
I would say definitely not. So discrimination based on gender has been around since the beginning of time. And I would suggest that, as with many other social issues that we've seen recently, it garners attention because there's this easy access to other people's experiences through the internet and social media. And what happens is it creates a momentum that really might not have occurred otherwise, or certainly might not have occurred as swiftly and as widely as it has occurred, such as with the Me Too campaign, for example.
Susan?
Yeah, I really don't have too much to add to that. I think all you have to do is turn on an old movie and you'll see that people are harassing females in those movies all the time, patting them on the rear end, saying how they look, talking about their clothing. It just was not actionable because there was no law in the workplace that applied to these issues, and therefore women just were subjected to it and dealt with it. Otherwise, they lost their job. And indeed, still, there are very rare instances where the law actually says thou shalt not sexually harass somebody. It's covered by Title VII, which is sex discrimination. And as Lisa spoke to in another podcast, this covers males and females, as well as in some jurisdictions, same-sex discrimination, which is not necessarily, the federal law, although the EOC says that's applicable. However, it's really the courts that are defining what sexual harassment is. It's not that it didn't exist before it did.
Susan, you practiced law in this area for a long time. You have lots of cases and lots of experience. What's the worst example that you can think of that you had to litigate?
I'll give you an interesting example because we were defending a building that was actually used as a mall. And we thought the case was the female head of the mall against her employer, who was the owner of the whole real estate business. When I was taking the deposition of what I thought was a witness, it was a male, he started crying in the middle of the deposition. This is this big, strong guy who was her enforcer, essentially, and then admitted that she was harassing him. And he was so uncomfortable in that situation and had no outlet, which we will address at another time, that he was being discriminated against on a constant basis. The other thing that seemed to happen all the time was when people were on business trips or at Christmas parties. And I think, probably Lisa would talk to that as well, that people, when they're partying or drinking, tend to do things which are extremely offensive to other employees. And this is often not even a boss versus employee situation. It's very often just between people who are working in the workplace on an equivalent basis. But those circumstances can get very uncomfortable and include very often touching and inappropriate comments.
Yes, Christmas parties and other parties can lead to that. I've seen that myself.
And business trips. I've seen people who were thinking they were just having a meeting with their boss and instead were sexually assaulted in a room. Unbelievably, this kind of thing still goes on.
I would also add, Fred, that we've got, of course, Title VII, but there's other laws, like public policy laws, that could come into play. And that reminds me of a case that happened here in Arizona, Wagner versus Scottsdale Healthcare Systems. And this is a case where a nurse from the emergency room went tubing, and anyone who lives in Arizona knows what tubing is. It's going down the Salt River in a tube all day.
Especially with a six-pack of something attached to the tube that floats.
Exactly. That's exactly
tubing.
how it works.
That's right.
And this nurse went tubing with several other people from the emergency room, and several of them had quite a bit to drink, and at one point decided to do a rendition of Blue Moon or some song such as that, and mooned everybody on the river. And this employee did not follow suit with the rest of her colleagues. And that alone, in that one incident, especially because her leader was not there that I'm aware of, might not have been constituted sexual harassment. Here's what did. And in this case, it was a public policy issue because she ended up being harassed when she went back to work. She went back to work, and they continued to really harass her and give her a hard time about the fact that she didn't participate. And it became so invasive and so impossible, she couldn't work there anymore. It was untenable for her. So my point is, even things that might happen outside of work and the incident itself may or may not have constituted harassment, what happens back at the workplace related to that incident could constitute either a public policy violation or sexual harassment.
I just thought of another case which was very flagrant and unhappy circumstance. It took place in a fire station among firefighters. And what they were doing when there was a woman brought in to be a firefighter, and that still is a fairly unusual circumstance, is that they were literally urinating in her boots so that when she'd have to go jump into the boots to go put out the fire, she had the wrong kind of water with her. So she eventually filed a complaint and was successful in those circumstances. But it doesn't make it any easier for her to go to work the next day, even if she wins, which is the problem.
That's correct. Do they do follow-on cases where if they go to work the next day and they won the case, she won the case, and they continue that kind of behavior, or it's just sort of the cold, silent treatment?
Well, it'll depend on the employer. It depends on whether you're a good learner or not, because you can't retaliate against somebody for filing a complaint. You can't ignore the fact that it's continuing. You know, it behooves you, once you put a policy into effect, that you follow your policy, let alone, you know, the policy of the state or municipality or whatever jurisdiction you're in. So I think once an employer knows or should have known that something's going on, it's incumbent upon them to make sure it's not continuing.
Very interesting subject matter, and I thank both of you for sharing your thoughts, ideas, and the law on the idea of what constitutes sexual harassment and the prevalence of that in the current workplace. So I thank you, both Lisa Barrington and Susan Savitt, for your gracious comments and time.
Thanks for joining us. If you wish to speak with Fred, or you want a transcript of this interview, send an email to podcast@stuartcoopercoon.com. See you soon.